Welcome. This is Vivian Louie, Program Officer at the William T. Grant Foundation. I'm joined by our President, Adam Gamarin, and our Senior Program Officer, Kim Dumas. Thank you for tuning in today. You've joined part one of a two-part webinar series on changing the conversation about inequality. How do we get to reducing inequality? We pose questions through the question inbox in the webinar system, and we look forward to receiving your questions. There'll also be 2 points in the presentation where we'll pause to respond to some of the questions raised, but due to time constraints, we will not be able to answer them all. The William T. Grant Foundation has 2 focus areas in grant making on youth outcomes. Our Youth of Research Evidence Initiative focuses on understanding the role of research evidence and how it is used in policy and practice. Our Reducing Inequality initiative was launched in 2014 and is the focus of this 2-part webinar series. The defining feature of the Reducing Inequality initiative is a focus on responses to inequality, not its causes or consequences. We intend to support research that helps us understand how programs, policies, and practices can mitigate the impact of inequality on young people in the United States. The goal of this 2-part webinar series is to share what we mean by response to inequality and to show how a research study can inform a response to inequality. Foundation staff have reviewed several hundred letters of inquiry to date. One of the things we realized is that researchers find it challenging to formulate a research study that addresses a response to inequality. This is not surprising, since social scientists are trained to describe the nature and extent of inequality along with its causes and consequences. While addressing a response to inequality is certainly related to this kind of effort, it is also qualitatively different. Our goal with this 2-part webinar series is to discuss what a response to inequality might look like in a research study on youth outcomes. To do that, we draw on papers commissioned by the Foundation on 4 topics, where we thought new directions for research on reducing inequality seemed imminent: post-secondary education and workforce development, immigrant children and families, the justice systems for juveniles and young adults, and child and adolescent mental health. The authors of these papers each make the case that pursuing research along the lines they suggest could reverse recent trends in the rise of inequality. Today, we'll focus on post-secondary education and workforce development along with the justice system. In the fall webinar, we'll focus on intersecting inequalities among immigrant origin children and youth, and mental health services. But these topics certainly do not exhaust the many domains where research to reduce inequality can be focused. Our foundation is interested in supporting studies across a range of systems, including the education, child welfare, and justice systems, and in varied settings, such as neighborhoods, schools, families, and communities. I also just wanted to let you know what today's webinar will not address. I'm sure many of you have thoughtful questions about the process of applying for our major grants competition, what we fund and do not fund, how to write a letter of inquiry when applications are due. And we certainly have thoughtful answers to those questions available in other formats. We'll type in what those formats are so you can see them on your computer. Just as examples, you can consult the FAQs on our Foundation's website. A 2-part blog post I wrote on tips for writing a letter of inquiry for our Reducing Inequality initiative. If there's time later in the presentation, I'll briefly bring us back to these and additional important resources that you might find helpful. So let's turn to what we will address in today's webinar. First, I'll give a brief introduction to the Reducing Inequality initiative. Then I'll turn to 2 papers commissioned by the Foundation on how to make the transition from describing and understanding inequality to reducing inequality. I want to be clear, these are the writer's recommendations for where we can go, not the Foundation. The first paper is by sociologist James Rosenbaum, and and focuses on post-secondary education and workforce transition. What I'll do is briefly lay out the findings of that report, then I'll spend some time discussing the research directions laid out in the report for reducing inequality and how they map onto the types of studies we typically fund. We'll then have some Q&A. I'll follow much of the same format for criminologist John Law's paper on the justice system. But before we get started, I want to remind us again, the lines of further inquiry for reducing inequality suggested by these two papers are intended as illustrative examples. These examples are meant to stimulate, not end the conversation. We definitely want your path-breaking ideas. All right, let's move forward. At the William T. Grant Foundation, we make a 4-point case for supporting research on reducing inequality among young people in the United States. Point 1, inequality is excessive. This is the case in many nations. That said, the Foundation's focus is the United States. Point 2, these high levels of inequality stand in the way of our economic and civic progress. Point 3, rising inequality is not a foregone conclusion. Our own history and that of other nations reveal many times when social policies have reduced inequality. And finally, point 4. But to get there, we need new research to help us identify effective policies, programs, and practices. The key takeaway, there's certainly lots more to learn about what generates inequality, but we think we know enough to build a body of evidence on potential gap closers in youth outcomes. At the William T. Grant Foundation, we are convinced that social science research on youth development can play an important role in addressing the challenge of inequality. How can we build a body of evidence on potential gap closers in youth outcomes? Several hallmarks define our foundation, ages 5 to 25. Second, although we recognize that no single study will lead to major studies, we fund to culminate in approaches that reduce inequality. That's why we prioritize programs, policies, and practices. We focus on how inequality can be reduced by implementing a program, policy, or practice. Studies may also address the key dilemma that practitioners or policymakers face in addressing unequal youth outcomes, or challenge assumptions that underlie current approaches. Finally, our portfolio is broadly interdisciplinary, drawing on ideas and tools from sociology, psychology, and beyond. How might this approach look in post-secondary education and workforce development? In 1988, the William T. Grant Foundation issued The Forgotten Half, a report on non-college bound 16 to 24-year-olds. 24 years later, using data on young adults in 2012, James Rosenbaum and his colleagues have written a report about the new Forgotten Half. The increased college access over the past few decades, thanks to a college for all ideal, emphasizing the necessity and importance of a college education. Enrollment at four-year colleges continues to climb, but it is the expansion of community colleges, college access, in the era of college for all. From their inception, community colleges were meant to reduce inequality to higher education. Thanks to low tuition, convenient locations, and open admissions, community colleges enroll nearly as many students as public four-year colleges. That's the upside. But despite high enrollment, community colleges have very low completion rates. Many students get stuck in remedial classes and ultimately drop out without transferring to four-year colleges or attaining a credential. That's the downside. The authors further found that some college with no credential has no earnings payoff. Youth with some college but no credential are the new forgotten half. To be clear, our foundation is not interested in funding studies about why some youth drop out of community college, as important as that is, because that does not take us close enough towards reducing inequality. Building on what is already known about the nature, extent and drivers of inequality, Jim Rosenbaum and his colleagues proposed new directions for research that would take us towards reducing inequality. Because community colleges serve so many young people, especially low-income youth, the authors recommend a focus on improving community colleges as a response to growing inequality. These suggested directions map on to the different types of studies that we commonly fund in this initiative. Within the Reducing Inequality Initiative, we support different types of studies, including descriptive studies, meant to clarify the mechanisms for reducing inequality, intervention studies that examine attempts to reduce inequality, and finally, studies that improve the measurement of inequality in ways that will enhance the work of researchers, practitioners, or policymakers. To give you an idea of what these could look like, let's map on Jim Rosenbaum's suggested lines of inquiry. One could develop a descriptive study that identifies strategies to improve students' understanding of the options, obstacles, and outcomes of the new college reality. The authors call out what they describe as the perils of hidden time traps in community colleges and their impact on credential attainment. One could develop an intervention study that focuses on how to improve information on the new college reality for high school and college counselors, as this could potentially reduce inequality in student outcomes. This kind of intervention would give counselors relevant information and successful procedures aimed at low-income or academically struggling youth. In another vein, interventions can be designed to help students and their families understand the financial aid system and get the funds they need. One could develop a study that broadens our measures from a narrow focus on earnings to include critical aspects of job quality. These can include attaining responsible roles, positive career prospects, and a respected place in the adult world. Jim Rosenbaum further calls out the need for studies to examine how non-VA credentials can help young people today achieve these outcomes. Rosenbaum and his co-authors share valuable suggestions about research that can help us with institutional reforms that would improve the high school-college alignment, structure college procedures, and school-work linkages. We imagine that these studies could be descriptive, intervention-based, or measurement-focused. Again, I want to remind us, though, that these lines of further research suggested by Jim Rosenbaum are meant as illustrative examples. We definitely want your best ideas. So on that note, let's hear from you.
We have a question from some folks wondering if the slides will be made available following the presentation.
Yes, they will. We will share them on our website. Okay. So we have another question on studies that analyze impacts or that are descriptive in nature. Thank you for a great question. We actually support studies with kind of multiple goals. So certainly those that are descriptive that would describe what we need to know to inform strategies for responding to inequality would be one. Another would be to test existing programs, policies, and practices to see whether and how they reduce inequality. And as I mentioned earlier, a third, those that can improve measures of inequality that researchers, practitioners, or policymakers can use.
I also have a question, maybe I'll ask Adam since he's here, about how we're defining and operationalizing inequality.
Thanks, Kim. We think about inequality in two ways. One is in the overall dispersion of some valued outcome, for example, income or test scores. And the second is with respect to group differences in these outcomes, racial and ethnic differences, differences by economic background, or by immigrant origins. Our interest is in reducing the first and eliminating the second. We think it's unrealistic and probably not desirable to completely eliminate the variation in outcomes, but we know that it doesn't have to be as excessive as it is today. group differences, on the other hand, we can work towards eliminating completely.
Vivian, we have another question wondering if we prefer studies that analyze impacts or that are descriptive in nature.
Vivian, another question that that we get a lot is, what's the what types of inequality are of interest to us? For example, disability or sexual orientation or immigrant status?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Adam. What a great question that you've conveyed for us. We're interested in inequality on the basis of race, ethnicity, economic standing, and or immigrant status. That said, we're also interested in research on inequalities in other areas, for example, those that you've just mentioned, if applicants can make a compelling case that the research will improve youth outcomes.
And one reader who is clearly one listener who is clearly an avid follower of our materials would like to ask about the role of the paper Inequality Matters by Prudence Carter and Sean Reardon in our thinking about this topic generally and with respect to post-secondary education in particular.
Definitely the paper that was written by Prudence Carter and Sean Reardon is important in the sense of kind of kicking off our commission papers on inequality. However, they take a broader look, and so we're interested specifically on the reducing inequality piece. And with post-secondary and higher education, we're interested in the types of questions, for example, that have been outlined in Jim Rosenbaum's paper, but also other directions if you feel that they are compelling and having the reducing inequality piece. We certainly invite your best ideas.
And I would encourage other listeners to have a look at the Carter and Reardon, which is on our website in the resources section. And they identify several points that elaborate on points that Vivian Louie has made today, such as the focus on reducing inequality, such as different domains of inequality. Yes, thank you. Vivian, another listener has asked, are we focused on inequality of opportunity or inequality of outcomes? Is there more emphasis on one or more emphasis on the other?
We're interested in reducing research that would move us towards reducing inequality in youth outcomes.
We have a number of questions, Vivian, about the mechanics of applying and the specific kinds of studies that we're interested in. I think that you said you're going to try to get to a couple of those at the end, or at least post links to where folks can find that information. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely can.
Are we only interested in studies involving high school and undergraduate students, or is there an interest in students in graduate studies as well?
Another great question. Thank you, Adam, for conveying it. So we're interested in studies that apply to youth outcomes. And the way that we define youth is ages 5 to 25 in the United States.
Could you say more about what might fall under the descriptive studies category? Perhaps some example of kind of studies, perhaps helping us understand how a descriptive study can give information on reducing inequality?
Sure. Another thoughtful question. Thank you, Adam. So descriptive studies, again, they describe what we need to know to inform strategies for responding to inequality. So, for example, a case that I brought up earlier with emerging from Jim Rosenbaum's paper is a descriptive study could identify strategies that would improve students' understanding of their options, the odds, the obstacles, and the outcomes of the new college reality. These are important things that we need to know to actually develop a strategy for responding to inequality.
And going back to your answer to the previous question, what if you're focusing on a population that's largely within the 5 to 25 age range, but some of the subjects are outside that range? Would that still qualify?
Well, we definitely would need to know the primary research questions must focus on children or youth within the 5 to 25 age range.
And I love the way you're referring to our frequently asked questions to answer some of these questions. And I want to I want to encourage listeners to do the same. We do have a frequently asked question session, and some of you are submitting questions that are more about the mechanics of applying or what the grants allow, and I'm going to refer you to the website for answering those questions, and also to Vivian's 2 blog posts on tips for succeeding in the Reducing Inequality Grants competition to answer those questions. This webinar, we're really focusing on the substantive questions about the kinds of research questions that we're focusing on, what we mean by inequality, whether we're focusing on opportunity, and so on.
Great. Vivian, maybe one more question is that several folks, since you focused this discussion on community fund college going, are wondering if we're limited to folks in that age group, or if we'd be willing to entertain studies of elementary and middle school curriculum that might eventually reduce inequalities in college or in and of themselves. Or alternatively, if folks were doing a study in college, there may be students who are older, and how do we handle that in terms of eligibility for being able to study? So maybe the majority of students are 18 to 25, but somebody might be 28 years old.
Sure, another great question, Kim. Again, the answer would be that the primary research questions must focus on children or youth within the 5 to 25 age range.
And can I sneak one question that I'll respond to myself about whether we would, what we mean by research, and particularly whether design-based implementation research would qualify as research. And so my answer to that is we are interested in research on helping understand how to build, understand, improve, and test programs, policies, and practices that reduce inequality. So if you're trying to build and understand a practice that would reduce inequality, design-based implementation research would be one way to do that.
And I'll also take one question real quick just on kind of our interest. Someone is asking, must the studies be national in nature, or can they be focused on a particular area or region? And we like to say that we lead with a research question, and whether it's the study that's carried out is national in focus or place-based, that there's an opportunity for broader learning. So we welcome both, as long as the learning that can happen is broader than a single context.
So we are going to need to move on. There are some more questions, and we will try to cover, we have another section of the webinar where we're going to take questions, and we'll do our best to get as many of them in as we can.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kim and Adam, and all the listeners out there. Okay, so now let's turn to John Lobb's report on juvenile and criminal justice. John Lobb points to what he calls the basic fact. Criminal offending and criminal victimization for common law crimes are not randomly distributed across persons and places. Inequalities exist in patterns of serious criminal offending and serious criminal victimization prior to any contact with the justice system. For instance, the existing research shows that crime, especially violent crime, is concentrated by place. It appears that structural disadvantage, such as neighborhood poverty and social organization of neighborhoods, affect the behavior of residents. John Lobb asks us to think of inequalities that are present prior to contact with the justice system as input, and to think of the effects of the justice system response that reinforce and sharpen existing inequalities as output. John Lobb argues that we should focus both on reducing fundamental inequities in the United States and on how the justice system worsens existing inequality amongst its young people. John Lobb outlines some promising places to start. Again, I want to be clear, we're not interested in what is driving these inequalities, but rather what can be done to reduce them. So we would be interested in where and how the school-to-prison pipeline can be broken. For instance, John Lobb suggests a research focus on best practices to keep and engage unruly and sometimes violent students in schools. John Lobb sees the need for studies to analyze the effects of police practices, such as stop and frisk. Is aggressive policing a necessary trade-off for lower crime and reductions in incarceration. He further brings up the often hidden collateral consequences of police surveillance and control on young people. For instance, one researcher working with high-risk populations has found that people with any contact with the criminal justice system, such as being stopped by the police, arrested, convicted, or incarcerated, they're less likely than people without any contact to engage with surveilling institutions. Surveilling institutions can be medical, financial labor markets, and schools. This means that an already marginalized group of people is further cut off from institutions that would help them desist from crime and integrate them into broader society. John Lobb calls out the need to test these findings in the general population, to know if low levels of involvement in the justice system, such as police stops, have the same effect as deeper involvement, such as incarceration. In either case, research could look at ways to keep young people engaged with crucial institutions that could improve their outcomes. Finally, John Lobb calls for research on changing thinking patterns, including hope for a future. He identifies a critical challenge for research as determining how to keep youth in disadvantaged circumstances engaged and hopeful about their futures so that they invest in their futures. And I want to be clear, these are John Lobb's thoughtful recommendations for where we can go, not the foundation. You may have an idea in these topic areas, or you may not. But the important thing is we want your best idea. So again, let's hear from you.
So we've got a number of questions, and there are more appearing every second. Keep them flowing. One question, I want to jump back to the Rosenbaum paper. Of course, that paper focuses on the transition from secondary to post-secondary education and the transition to the workforce. So I think some listeners have gotten the impression that people doing research on education supported by the William T. Grant Foundation are only focusing on the secondary and post-secondary years. Could you clarify that for our listeners?
Sure, Adam. Thanks for the great question. The answer to that is no. We are not just interested in the secondary and post-secondary years of education. Again, we're interested in the age group ages 5 to 25, youth in the United States. And clearly that covers a lot of ground in our educational system.
Thanks. And a couple of people have asked questions about the relation among different types of research that we fund. You mentioned descriptive studies, intervention studies, measurement studies. And one person put it like this: could you imagine a study that both tested an intervention and provided descriptive information on the mechanisms? Another person asked, I think had perhaps something similar in mind, where they asked about a multi-phased project where perhaps phase 1 is more descriptive and phase 2 is more causal. Could you imagine either of these two types of scenarios within our funding stream?
Yes, Adam, absolutely. Those sound great.
Another listener asked about the connection between our use of research evidence initiative and our reducing inequality initiative. Of course, use of research evidence is our other research priority, which we're not addressing in this webinar. But perhaps you could just comment on whether those are meant to be fused or whether those are really two separate streams of work.
Another great question. Applicants are certainly welcome to study both research-focused areas. However, we found that few applicants are able to do this well, and we found that the most successful applications address a few research questions within a single area.
We're also seeing some folks who are wondering whether you could say a couple of words about the proposals we've reviewed so far, and if they weren't fitting, why that was. What I'd like to do is refer those individuals who are interested in seeing that to Vivian's 2 blogs on applying for funding, which really provides an analysis of the early letters of inquiry we saw and some recommendations to how to avoid the pitfalls where people didn't fit our interests.
Another listener would ask about our interest in health outcomes. Is that reducing inequality in health outcomes? Is that of interest to the foundation?
Yes. I mean, we're currently focused on academic, behavioral, social, and economic youth outcomes. That said, we will consider research on other outcomes.
And we would also consider mental health outcomes to be an aspect of social outcomes. So mental health outcomes clearly fall within our priority areas.
Yes.
We're also having a repeated question about whether our dollars fund just research or research and program, or the intervention work that's being studied. And typically we use about a 5 to 10% rule that the dollars can go towards program dollars, and the rest, the majority, clear majority, should go to the research dollars.
These are great questions. We're just working through them.
So some folks are asking, what if they have a proposal with an idea and they'd like to partner with a community to put in an application? Do they need to have worked out the research questions and design before they put in? Or is it acceptable to put in a proposal that just says, we're going to partner and we're going to figure this out en route?
Great question, Kim. Thank you for sharing it. So the letter of inquiry process is highly competitive, and we encourage applicants to involve their research partner to develop the strongest application possible. And if you're a researcher proposing to work with a community-based organization, the letter should really reflect your partner's motivation for the project and show a nuanced understanding of the particular context at hand.
Adam, I think there's one question for you. Some folks are asking whether or not we'd be interested in interventions that work for a particular group, or whether we're interested in universally beneficial intervention. How do you think about, and how might you think about that in terms of reducing inequality?
That's a great question, Kim. Thanks for giving me the chance to respond. Well, you can imagine inequality, you can imagine an intervention reducing inequality in one of two ways. Either it's an intervention that works for everyone, and in that case, you need to apply it differentially to the disadvantaged group in order for inequality to be reduced. By contrast, if there's an intervention that works especially well, that has especially large impact for a disadvantaged group, then you can apply it universally, and it will have a gap-closing impact. So take the example of class size reduction. There's some evidence that class size reduction has its biggest effects on the most disadvantaged groups. So you can apply it universally and still have some role in gap closing. Of course, if you apply class size reduction to those who are most in need of educational improvement, it will have even bigger gap closing effects.
So we have another question. So we've talked a bit about having teams come in with multiple roles, community and researchers. And some folks are wondering, is it okay for researchers to come in alone as proposed with their own proposal, or do they have to partner with a community agent?
You do not have to partner with a community agent. I mean, the bigger answer to this very thoughtful question is the choice of the investigator really depends on the questions with which you're seeking to.
Thank you. And here's a question from a listener. Would we be willing to fund research that would help develop an intervention if there's no existing intervention for a particular problem?
So, I mean, we would need to know more about whether there's been a pilot or feasibility studies that have been done for this to show a compelling rationale for the particular intervention in which you're interested.
You know, some people have the impression that the William T. Grant Foundation only funds intervention studies. Could you dispel that myth for us?
Yes, thank you. So we definitely do not privilege one type of research design over another. We understand that important research questions come in many different forms, and we have supported studies using a wide range of designs and methods.
If a research project were testing an individual intervention, would you expect the outcomes examined to focus on individuals, for example, those receiving the intervention compared to a comparison group? Or would you expect the study to focus on broader outcomes community, school, or system level in which the intervention operates?
It's a terrific question, Adam. Thank you for sharing. So again, that would depend upon the particular research questions in which you're interested in answering and how it's situated in the relevant literature.
Now, one of our listeners is aware that only nonprofit organizations, tax-exempt organizations, are eligible to receive our funds. But the listener is wondering whether that means it has to be a university or a research firm, or whether a school district, perhaps with consulting from a research partner, could be the recipient of a grant.
Kim, why don't you take that question?
Yes, I think anyone who's consistent with the nonprofit tax-exempt status would be eligible to do that.
However, we found that to mount a successful effort, you need considerable participation from experienced researchers in the application.
We also have some questions about whether we would consider applications that are using existing data rather than collecting new data.
Yes, that is absolutely fine.
In our experience with that is that it's really important to ask yourself whether the existing data set that you're identifying is up to the task of answering the research questions you have. But we can give a number of examples where we have funded such studies.
Now, our emphasis on youth outcomes has made some listeners wonder whether we're willing to fund research on the adults who are providing services to youth, whether it's officials in the justice system, or actors in a post-secondary setting, or teachers in a school. Can we support research on these adult providers of services, or is the focus only on the youth recipients of services?
Thank you for the question, Adam. So yes, we can. The studies can address the adult providers of the services, but again, the links to youth outcomes have to be made clear and be compelling.
Some listeners are wondering whether it's feasible to carry out a study where you're examining an institution. In the case of this question, it's a listener, it's a school. In the case of this listener, it's a school. So you're examining the institution in a holistic way. Does that type of design work in our process?
So I would need some greater clarification about what holistic way means.
Perhaps as a case, let's imagine we're talking about a case study, as opposed to a comparison of specific practices across institutions.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification. So that would qualify so long as it describes, again, what we would need to know to inform strategies for responding to inequality.
Now, one of our listeners is confused about a previous question where we said that only nonprofits can apply for funding, and now they're wondering whether university professors can apply for the funding. So having been a university professor recently, I'm going to take that question. As you may know, grants are never awarded to individuals. They're always awarded to institutions. So a university professor is eligible to apply for a grant through his or her institution, not as an individual operating alone.
Great, thank you.
We have a couple of questions about the justice system itself, and wondering if you would consider applications that focus on a single location of that justice. Particularly in this case, they're wondering if they're examined risk assessment practices, if it and looked at how that relates to different outcomes, whether that would fit within the Reducing Inequality Initiative or not.
So let me try to understand the question. So the question is about whether a study in a particular geographic context would on
juvenile
justice would apply for our Reducing Inequality Initiative.
Yes, and they were asking specifically, would we fund a study that looks at how risk assessments within that justice system, say the intake assessment, relates to outcomes?
so long as, again, the applicant makes a compelling case about where the link is to reducing inequality.
One person would like to know, gives us the challenging question of, in a descriptive study, how can we measure gap closing interventions?
That's a great question. I mean, that is really particular to the researcher and the study that the researcher is designing. So not every study can be descriptive and not every study can be about an intervention.
Vivian, I want to go back to the risk assessment questioning because we had a follow-up question to that. And the follow-up question, I think, is really good for you to hear. So there, again, we have the risk assessment within juvenile justice. And you said, yes, it would be consistent with reducing inequality if they made a compelling case to say what that lever would be. And they wrote back, great, and I'm particularly interested in the under-identification of problems. So I'm asking you, does that still fit with what you think of as reducing inequality, or how is that consistent with our focus, or how would they move that towards informing a response?
So then you would have to show the dimension of inequality that's being studied. And again, we're interested in inequality on the basis of race, ethnicity, economic standing, and or immigrant origin status. So you'd have to locate the under-identification of problems in one or more of those dimensions and make a compelling case that what you are seeking to do will actually reduce inequality on the particular dimension at hand.
Great. I think that's really clear for folks to understand.
I think that's it for the substantive questions there. We do continue to get questions about the mechanics of applying, and for that we do want to refer people to the website and to the blog post that Vivian has put up previously on this topic. Also, we had a previous webinar on the research grants competition, and that went into more details on the mechanics. And finally, at the end of the webinar, we're going to share all the links for all the resources that we've mentioned throughout this discussion. Let me turn it back over to Vivian Louie to continue the webinar.
Thank you, Adam. What a wonderful segue you've given us. So here we are. We're nearing the close of today's webinar. And before we close, we just want to call out several of the resources on our foundation website that you might find helpful. And Adam Gadmaran has already mentioned some of them, but let me just kind of reiterate. Adam, our president, has written an essay entitled Inequality is the Problem, Prioritizing Research on Reducing Inequality, featured in our 2013 annual report. You might also check out our 5 commission papers on inequality across different domains. For insights on the grant application process, as Adam mentioned, you might check out our 2014 webinar on the major grants competition, a 2-part blog post I wrote with tips for writing a letter of inquiry for reducing inequality, and our research application guide. We're working on that? Okay. So finally, some upcoming dates. If you think your interests fit ours in the Reducing Inequality Initiative, we look forward to receiving your letters of inquiry, the first step in the grants process. The next deadline is August 4th, 2015. And if you have interest in reducing inequality in immigration and in mental health services, we look forward to having you join us again in the fall for our webinar on those important topics. In the meantime, just spread the word, reducing inequality. Thank you for tuning in today. Till next time.
And I think we are going to post, we just sent the links through the comment system, so everybody should have received them now. And then in addition, we'll be posting the slides from the webinar on our website very soon, and you'll be able to find those links there as well. So thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Vivian Louie, for doing such a great job, and we look forward to seeing your applications. You want to take